Hello, everyone. Welcome to our sixth panel discussion for the wounded workforce. We are talking about the principles of trauma-informed workplaces, and I am so thrilled to be talking about humility and responsiveness today. As always, we have an amazing group of panelists with us, and we'll get started by allowing everyone to have a chance to introduce themselves. So we'll kick it off first with you, Julia, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, and thank you for creating this space. And I'm so happy to be here today. My name is Julia Sadnia. I've been in the talent and people space for 13 years now. I'm a senior strategic director of people. And this topic is near and dear to my heart for many reasons, from receiving humility and from giving it to, my team and others around me. So I'm super excited to be here and thanks for having me.
Amazing. So great to have you, Julia. Kate.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm Kate Johnson. I am the owner of 123, focused on leadership and learning and development consulting. I have a background in human resources, like Stephanie, and I spent the last 20 years working in healthcare. So being, right there with the people on the front line during the pandemic, and learning almost every day what I didn't know. So, like Julia, this is a topic that I'm excited to have some time to discuss with other women in the field.
Amazing. Thanks, Kate. Dory.
Hi, guys. This is so exciting. Thanks, Stephanie, for inviting us to talk about this today. It's one of those topics that I think folks are uncomfortable about talking about. So that's even more exciting to me because I like to talk about uncomfortable topics. Dory Gonzalez Acevedo. I am co-founder and CEO of PercellaRx. We are a life science strategic consulting firm that focuses on computer software validation in the healthcare and life science space. I've been in this field for over 25 years, but a true, like, on my own and for the last 15 years. And when I set out to make this new company, part of that premise for me was to do it as inclusive as possible, as open as possible, in alignment with my values and my journey over the last 10 years of recovery and for a variety of different things. And so this topic is just super juicy because I think it's at the heart of so many people that we just don't want to talk about it. But if we can, and we can get over that hump of that discomfort, we can actually get to something really great. So thanks.
I completely agree. And I was worried no one would want to talk about this topic. And here I have these three fantastic women joining us. So I'm equally thrilled. And I agree, it's a juicy topic. It's an interesting one. And I always forget to introduce myself at the beginning of these. But just briefly, I'm Stephanie Lemick. I'm a former HR executive and founder of the Wounded Workforce. And we're all about building trauma-informed workplaces. Before we dive into our discussion, I always like to take a few minutes and set the stage for our discussion topic and talk about humility and responsiveness as it relates to trauma-informed workplaces. So when we think of the old adage, hurt people, it certainly comes to mind as we dive into this topic. We've explored in earlier discussions, traumatic experiences are common, and the effects of trauma can appear in sometimes unexpected ways, including ways that may harm others. But prior traumatic experience is not ever an excuse to harm others. It's important that an avenue exists to acknowledge the likeliness of missteps and moving forward from them in a productive, trauma-informed way to ensure ongoing growth and success for individuals and organizations as well. And humility is key to that. And humility is one of those words that gets thrown out a lot. So I want to think about things we consider aspects of humility. So we're all working from a similar definition before we dive in. So key components of humility are a willingness to see ourselves truthfully, an accurate perception of our place in the world, an ability to acknowledge our mistakes and limitations, openness, low self-focus, and appreciation of the value of all things. Without humility, it is very difficult for individuals and organizations to acknowledge their errors, missteps, or different perspectives that showcase potential harm. The openness and appreciation for others ingrained in our definition is key for the recognition of harm and missteps. However, humility alone is not enough. Without meaningful action and acknowledgement to correct harm, the issue remains and often festers, getting worse and creating new issues impacting even more people. Responsiveness works hand in hand with humility to complete the trauma informed principle. That is really big and weighty. And the truth is, humility and responsiveness is a really big and weighty part of a trauma informed culture. It was also kind of, should say magical, but this magical piece of a trauma informed culture that allows your culture to be evergreen because it's giving you the tools within your values to change and get better and respond to your community, your team members, the communities you serve. So obviously, I'm thrilled to have this conversation. So we'll dive into the first question, and I'd love to start with a personal story from each of you. Can you share an example from your career when you had to rely on your own humility or a leader modeled humility and responsiveness for you or members of your team, and discuss the importance and impact to you or the team you were leading?
We can go in order as we did earlier, or
Sounds good.
freeform.
Go for it, Julia.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I was just wanting to open the space for anyone that wanted to go. For me, I think the first thing that comes to mind is my previous VP at Genvid. That she was someone that in the interview process, I was like, I want to work for her, and it wasn't because she sold me a dream of anything specific. It was because of the fabric of her character. And that ended up being how she led and how she manifested herself in the entire trajectory of us working together. And I can think of numerous times where she led with humility. And as you were speaking and defining this topic, I was just thinking about leading with service. And I think that goes hand in hand with humility. So one thing that my VP did well, and not just once, but multiple times, was leading with service, having the team's back, being accountable for what was going on. And when I say having the team's back, she literally, obviously we all report to somebody, especially if you're, in a larger company or in a company where you're not the sole person running things. And so she did a really good job balancing out accountability for what needed to happen and execute a response, and also making sure that everyone felt safe in what was going on with open communication and transparency. And I obviously value that within her, and we all trusted exactly what was going on, and we trusted her leadership, and that things would come to fruition in a way where we all felt respected. So that's what comes to mind for me. And I think, just talking about service within, hand in hand of humility, I think that if you're not with the mentality of like servitude and being service first, you have an egocentric approach to life, not just your job. And so it's really critical for people, anyone is a leader. So to lead with leadership, to lead with humility means to bring service at the forefront of what's going on.
Kate, do you want to go?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was processing still. Like, yeah. This is really good. I'll keep listening. My first thought was a few stumbles that I've had and rather than humility, it's trying to get back to a place of leading, having been humbled. and really embracing that, because I think humility and shame can be confused for each other. And the example that I first thought of when I read this question from you, Stephanie, was a time where I really failed with an employee. And I could try to justify and say, well, this was her part of it, this was my part of it. But at the end of the day, I was the leader. And having to actively set that aside and figure out, before we can move forward and get back to work, get back to productivity, what do I need to do to make repairs? Even if I don't agree with everything that she's concerned about, even though I can see, objectively and with other feedback, that not all of it was mine to own, that it was necessary for me to be humble so that our relationship could heal, and not to get dragged down into the beating myself up. That feeling humbled is not the same as being ashamed of something you've done or a mistake you've made. It's just that, let me embrace the fact that I'm human and I have weakness. And how do we get the work done together in face of the fact that in this particular case, I messed up?
Yeah. What you're saying, Kate, I was going to say something else, but brought to mind another opportunity to share around, for me, it's the being a woman, particularly in a very male-dominated field. Over the years, it's been a very fine line between how to be big enough to be heard and humble enough to not be out there, right? And I think that that has shown up in a couple of different ways. Sometimes I've been humbled, right? Because I've been too big in the room. And then sometimes I haven't been big enough and then have let the other side take control, which may not have necessarily been the right thing or in line with my values or all those sorts of stuff, right? But that fine line as a woman in a field like that it's been really hard to get to know myself enough to know and be self-aware enough of where are my faults, owning my faults, and being able to speak to my faults and my learnings very transparently, to the point where then it's not that shame that you talked about. Like, so it's not a shame, but it's actually showing up in my full authentic self so that I could be fully present. And that over the last 10 years has been a very big part of my coming out in a lot of different ways for my leadership style to be more in sync with my authenticity, as well as brought out my humility in a balanced way, such that I don't have to be shrunken, when I don't want to be, but I also don't have to be as big as I need to be in other scenarios.
Yeah. Dory, I think you raise a really good point that, we don't want to make sweeping generalizations, but there is a difference in this space for women and men. Yeah. Or, people that identify as women versus those that identify as male. And that, humility in a woman can be perceived as weakness, just as assertiveness can be perceived as aggressiveness. Right. And it can be, as so many workplaces are still very much, mired in that command control hierarchical setting, that trying to balance, I'm asserting myself, but I'm not egotistical, I'm humble, but I'm not a doormat. Right. It's still something that, women, particularly more seasoned, women who are in those executive spheres, that we have to
Yeah. And
We
I think
can
that's
juggle
changed
balance.
too, right? As there's
Mhm.
5 generations in the workforce today, right?
Yeah.
And so how does it show up in each generation also dramatically has changed over the
Mhm.
years. And so, and how to balance that. And so one of my values that I try to live from a leadership perspective is having a dialectical perspective on everything. It's both of those things are true at the same time. And how can I hold the space for all of those opinions or whatever it's coming at me, so that it creates a space to breathe. It's like, wow, not everyone is right, not everyone is wrong. Like, it's just
Mhm.
what it is, what it is, and what do we do with it?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you're bringing this up, because I think it's also like, how do we create a dialogue versus continuous combat for the things that not only we believe in, but that we need to, bring forward, and things that are relevant, and things that, every workforce is looking at right now, even if it's like a gradual embracement versus, a full adaptation from one day to the next. So there's so many, I think what we're all saying is that there's so many different components that lead us towards this topic. And also, besides our own individual stories of what we've encountered and how we've embodied this, there's also, certain determining factors that we don't control, aka like the environment and, everyone else that's part of, who we interact with and work with on a daily basis. And all of this is yes and, right? It's like these all exist, and how do we move forward versus sit here and harp on the problem at the end of the day.
I love this. There's some I think what's so amazing, and it proves my point, there are like the 3 most perfect people to have this discussion, is you are all kind of interrogating your own relationship with humility. And isn't that humility embodied? And I think there's something that I believe really strongly, and I think it ties into this conversation. I think there are leaders and there are people who care how things look, and then they care how things actually are. And it's the same difference as a leader who calls themselves a servant leader and a leader who actually serves. And I think this comes into play when we think about humility as well, because I think to be humble, you're not automatically going to go, oh, I'm so humble. I'm the most humble person I know.
I'm very self-aware.
It's this active engaging in the process of humility. And I love, Kate, I love that you brought up shame. And that we also have to challenge ourselves, especially when, we're a woman or another member of a marginalized community. Are we being humble? Or are we shouldering shame that we don't need to take on, that doesn't add value to ourselves or anyone we're attempting to serve as well? Oh, this is going to be such a juicy conversation. I can tell.
Well, and I think, Stephanie, it's, am I living out shame, or am I, through forceful humility or lack of humility, talk Kate, am I generating shame for others as well, particularly as a leader, but also as coworkers? If I'm not humble, if I'm always presenting as perfect, competent, capable, and flawless, one, it's not true, because people, but 2, you're not allowing humanity to be present on the team then.
One of the things I try to set, like, where I do for myself is, where have I failed today? Right. And as part of an active, like, I seek to fail. Like, first, I'm a scientist. So sometimes I say to myself, like, that's just part of like who I am, like from very, very little. It's kind of just what I've done. But in the same, like, that is an active participation, just like you're saying, stuff like to constantly saying, okay, so what about this works? What about this doesn't work? What did I, where did I actually fail today? I ask my team that, like, for feedback about that, like, and I try to lead by example. I think the leading by example, to your point, is something that there's still that looking good. Like, I'm not afraid of, I have no more masks, right? And the masks are shed for me in my life. And that allows me to show up completely, right? Because I'm not worried about that anymore. That's my own work that I had to do in order to get to this place. That's my hope for the world. But how do we get there is each of us having to do our part, right? Because that's all we can do.
Love that. So, oftentimes, we talk about a topic, humility, for example. It's like, well, how I want to cultivate humility in myself and my team, and where can I start? So I'd love to hear from each of you. What advice do you have, or how can leaders and managers cultivate a culture of humility within their teams and their organizations?
Let's go reverse order.
Love
just
it.
to keep it spicy. I don't know. Like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Well,
we will go in order, Julia.
I'll go. So part of the I do encourage my team to have time to vent, right? Like I have dedicated, so there is that time where you need to free think and not be censored about customer is not listening. This is not working. There's the venting process in my mind is essential part of getting to the next thing. So I do want them to be able to do that. Obviously, that's internally, that's, in safe space to be able to say all that stuff. And then it's figuring out the constructive thing, how to tackle what we need to do in order to move forward. I think that separation gives, and I've been trying to use brave space instead of psychologically safe space these days, right? To really to let them all speak. Because they might not be able to get to speak in front of a customer or others, in a bigger room, right? But at least internally, they can have that time to be able to share together. That's one of the things I've been working on.
Oh, it's my turn again. I'm sorry. I was making notes. I think the key is mistakes. Allowing them, encouraging them when it's not, going to severely undermine the business or the customer. In the space of healthcare and other industries, we talk about high reliability organizations. And one of the hallmarks of high reliability is a preoccupation with failure. And it doesn't mean that you're trying to avoid it. We acknowledge that failure is going to happen. Human error is part of our equation of doing business. So you embrace that, and then you figure out, how do we learn from it? Not, we're going to punish you because you messed up, but we'll figure out, how do we avoid this going forward? And I think one, as a leader, you have to be, I don't know, let's try, let's find out. When you do mess up, you own it. You model that for people, and you make it safe to be brave, to experiment, to test, to question. And again, it always has to be appropriate within whatever your industry is. Again, long time in healthcare, so I think about, patient safety should not be compromised. But if it's, outside of the bounds of whatever those safety, guidelines or regulations are, let it be an appropriate free-for-all. Because one, we learn so much when we mess up. And two, it drives innovation as well. So it just feels like it's the right way to do business. But I think mistakes are the way to cultivate it. Make it just part of how you work.
Yeah. Yes. So much yes. I think as I'm thinking of creating humility and how teams or individuals can foster that, I'm just thinking about the pillars of humility. And to me, those are vulnerability, accountability, and trust at the end of the day. And so how do you spread that to your team? How do you spread that to a company? It's by modeling that, for sure. And I think if I think of any situation where I empowered my team, or I empowered the business, it's through taking accountability and action myself first and showing that, even literally crying to my team for something that was literally going on that day and saying, how are you? Oh, you want to know how I am? Like, this is how I really am. And just leading with that. And that has always created openness. And yeah, like being vulnerable is where it's at. And I think as we started this conversation, I think something that has really transformed HR and the people space is really being people focused and people centered, instead of like, yes, HR is responsible for mitigating risk and, you know, protecting the company, of course. But I feel like there's this huge shift that has happened where HR really is there for the people, and you're there to empower and represent and also advocate for people at the end of the day, right? And so I think, you know, in thinking about how you can execute that, it's about embodying it and modeling it for everyone that you encounter.
So I'd like to add to Julia. So I use T as my acronym. So trust, education, and accountability. Everyone needs some T. And because the part that the education, what you're doing, Stephanie, around the wounded workforce, around your trauma-informed work, this is the area that I think is hugely underappreciated and needs to be spoken in, you know, at every kitchen table, right? Like there's so many different types of quote unquote trauma. And while I've had some of the big ones, there's also what I see within the folks that I work with on a day-to-day basis. For example, Kate, to your point of understanding where to make failures, right? In my field, there's been a lot of quality leadership folks that have been very, you know, I'll say suppressed over the years, or even beaten down a little bit around audits that they've encountered over the years. And this sort of constant beating up, if you will, has presented a persona that is now not, that is reacting in a stress response way, and not giving organizations a very difficult time to be able to make a transformation organizationally because of this legacy of ways in which we've done business. And so it's not so much any of the big T traumas anymore. I'm seeing it actually from organizations that have just been dysfunctional for so long in so many different ways, which we kind of took as routine, right? Like this is the way of doing business, but that's not how it has to be, right? And we have the opportunity now to actually do something different, to, you know, to both Kate and Julia's points, like getting to in there and refacing what HR is, right? Like HR, for all 10 wasn't supposed to deal with this stuff, right? That's a right. This is not why, you know, people that have been in HR came to HR. That's not like what you signed up for, was it, Julia?
It's so funny because you're making me think of this. I don't know if it was a quote or a meme, something that I saw on LinkedIn, and it was like HR, psychologist, office manager, And it was just like listing off all these things that HR is, but really isn't, right? But it's like we've taken on so much, and it's like it's no mistake that majority of, you know, this field is dominated by women who, and so it's like going back to the guilt and the shame. And it's like, granted, everyone has some type of little T or big T trauma that they've encountered in their life, right? And I don't discredit that just because someone identifies as being a woman or a man or male or female, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's like we all need to really take a pause and recognize what our role actually is and where we are put to add value versus take on more, right? And so I think this is something we can all identify with, but it's like, yeah, what you just said just reminded me of like the list of things that HR takes on, really, right?
And I think of that as an act of humility, like literally saying, this is all I'm really good at. I'm good at this. I'm not good at that. Where can we get help with that? Who has added value over here? right? And being able to just be honest about that, right?
Well, I think, Dory, too, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, go.
It's also, we have to address those dysfunctional, like historically dysfunctional relationships in organizations as well. Quality and operations, perfect example of that. Whether it's HR or a formal quality role, we're going to beat you with an audit, but also you're so resistant to the support that theoretically the audit's giving you that you just end up, constantly at loggerheads. And until that's resolved and everybody understands this is how we actually relate to each other and the why of the work we're doing, it's going to continue to be, well, we're piling all this stuff on HR, or quality is our enemy, or, those managers just don't get it.
Right.
So, you have to be humble enough to recognize I am probably making enemies where I need to be making allies. If for no other reason than my title or my function. And how do I go back to square one, or even get off the current board, if you will, and make a new game board for us to get our work finished?
I like that analogy.
Mhm.
We need to make up a new game. I like that a lot.
What that brings up for me is also, sorry, just really, really quick, I'll be fast, I promise, is like this concept of boundaries, right? Like, I think we forget sometimes, because of like the whole laundry list of things that we take on. We forget, like, it's almost like we want to be flexible and adaptable over honoring our boundaries. And boundaries change and flexibility changes. Like, so many things, that change is constant, as we know. So it's coming back to, what is my boundary? What is my role? Where do I add the most value? Because of course we can take on as much as we're willing to until we put down a boundary and refocus our energy where it needs to be, and where we can actually maximize and make an impact.
100%. Absolutely. I look at our conversation, and I have like this hot button where so often we have these conversations about making it safe to fail, or fail and learn from failure. How many of us really grew up, whether it's our childhood or, early adulthood or our careers, how many of us really experienced an environment where truly it was safe to fail? And how, I mean,
a loaded
really,
question, Stephanie. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a survivor of many different things. And so I hid failure at all costs in order to survive. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well into my 40s.
It's also, yeah, I would say I was raised in that type of environment. I'm very fortunate, in what my family life looked like. And I'm not wired for that. I am a perfectionist. I do have, generalized anxiety. I have always pushed myself harder than I ever needed to. So, it's nature, nurture. You can ask my therapist how, which is it for her. And it's a lot more of it has to do with just my own chemistry. So again, we're human, we're flawed. So you could come from a place that nurtures, that makes it okay to fail, and not have the internal toolkit to do that well.
Yeah.
I think on a familial and cultural and societal level, like, failure was, I don't think it was ever acceptable until recently, where there's again, there's this movement to acknowledge humanity at this stage in life, right? But if I think of my childhood, it was never acceptable to fail. It was never acceptable to get below an A. It wasn't acceptable to be, for lack of better words, mediocre. And so this, as my perception of my life, I look at it as it was never safe to fail, because the way that I look at failure now, I've had to rewire, reframe the definition of what, failure is and how it is acceptable from, my personal to my professional life. So I would warrant to say that it's a very new movement to make it safe to fail. And I also think that's why we're having this conversation, because it's not typical to say, oh, you failed, cool, like that's great. Like if you look at that word failure on a competitive edge, meaning whether it's you want to be the top salesperson at your company or you're competing in a sport, whatever the case is, if you're not the winner, then you're the loser, aka then you failed, right? So having this mindset shift in thinking, okay, like you don't have to necessarily beat yourself in order to achieve, it's a completely new concept, at least in my eyes.
I agree. And I think this concept exists at an intersection of trauma. I think it exists at an intersection of privilege. I think the people we see fail publicly and get chance after chance do it from a place of extreme privilege. And so to me, I'm big on the nuance. I'm big on understanding, the things we say often are a lot harder to put into practice than we want to admit. And acknowledging that is, half the battle. And for me, I love sharing this story because it's probably my worst moment as a leader, followed immediately by my most proud moment. I don't know if it was my best, but it was my most proud moment as I reflect on my leadership journey. And, when I first started managing someone, I was working with them on a project to kind of, stretch them, extend them, develop them. And I met with them and they did not have anything they needed ready to go. Like they kind of completely missed the boat. And I was frustrated. And then I took time and I reflected and I was like, yeah, because you managed them the way you would need to be managed. You did not manage this person by asking them what they actually needed. And then that next day, this person was so stressed out, so worried because they knew they did not get what they got done well. And I met again and I was like, you know what? I have to start this by apologizing to you because I did not give you what you needed to do this successfully. And then even worse, I made you feel like you did something wrong. And, I apologize. This is on me. And it's that simple. I think sometimes just saying, this is on me. I missed here and I'm sorry.
One of the things that I hear what you're saying, Stephanie, is acknowledging that there's expectations. Right. And we all come into things with expectations. And one of the things I know that I didn't learn growing up was how to manage my own expectations with others. I didn't understand how to negotiate for my own needs. Right. And the ability to be able to do that now with someone is so radically different. To start that conversation from the very start, say, okay, so I don't know what we're going to put in your performance plan because I don't know what you need. Like it would waste my time to come up with a whole bunch of metrics and a whole bunch of criteria to think that would be good for you when that doesn't motivate you, that doesn't bring you pleasure, it doesn't add value in what you bring to the table. And I'm looking at like all these job descriptions these days, right? And kind of just saying like, should we just throw all this stuff out? Right? To Julia, to your earlier point, like, how do we add value? And isn't that the point of what we do and why we're being compensated for what we do, right? Because something about us as an individual adds value for each of us. So what is that? And how can we maximize that? Because when we maximize that or create the environment for that to flourish, we all win.
Yeah. And when Stephanie was talking about just like going in and apologizing, I think that's like the number one, leading into vulnerability, of course, but I think apologizing for, and that's accountability, right? You took accountability for your part and everything is co-created, every situation. So I think like the essence of what you shared, Stephanie, to me is also this accountability and saying sorry. There's so much around vulnerability that I think is charged for us, like, don't say sorry, don't cry at work, don't blah, 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 whatever. Don't be yourself, basically. Don't be you, because you as human and your humanness isn't okay. But I think if we look at the reality of that, it's like, the more we peel off the layers of the way we think people expect us to show up, and the more we're willing to show up in our most authentic selves, aka heart-centered, open, vulnerable, leading with kindness, leading with compassion, leading with humility, that is going to make a huge impact. That's going to add a ton of value. And, you know, when you're talking about saying sorry and just like meeting the person where they were actually at, to me, I mean, yeah, I could see why that's like a huge moment that you were proud in your career, because not a lot of, you know, leaders, manager, bosses, etc., want to own their part. And I was going to say own your failure, but that's not even a failure. You actually caught yourself in a moment where you're like, oh, wow, I actually could have a bigger impact if I cater this to what this person actually needs instead of being on my own agenda. And not that you're wrong for leading in that way. It's like, being a new manager is hard. Being in new environments, it's really hard. And if you don't ask the obvious questions, what do you need? How can I best support you? What other resources are needed for you to do your job and do it well? These aren't questions that, you know, you need 20 years of experience, or like literally anyone can embody that. But we overcomplicate things because we think we need to show up in a certain way.
Yeah. The coaching that I've given to new leaders for years, and even seasoned leaders because they forget or they were never told, is that the first time that you don't get the result you want, it's on you. Like, I have to say, I wasn't clear. I didn't resource, you know, I didn't give the right time. It's not that the employee has decided they're there to make your life hard. It's what did I do or not do that enabled or disenabled this person? So you go back and you do it with kindness and humility to say, okay, Kate, this wasn't what I was expecting. Let's revisit what we discussed as the assignment. And then the second time, we start to look at the employee's actual like ability, performance, competency, attitude, all the things, right? But the first time, you have to take it on yourself as the leader, that their lack of performance reflects on how I managed that moment.
Yeah, what you said just reminded me, like, I use this all the time, and it's like, no one wakes up and they're like, I'm going to be not 100% today. I'm not going to be my best self. So it's like, people are literally showing up at their max capacity saying, this is what I think is my best self. So if they're not giving you the results you're looking for, of course, yes, I totally agree. It's like, you have to, you know, reframe, retry to, you know, deliver that piece of information that clearly didn't stick in the way that you wanted it to. But it's also remembering that the person in front of you this is their best self, even if it's their best self on that day, right? So accepting that we have a responsibility to also, you know, foster what's in front of us is really important.
Yep. I could fall back on, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go, Kate. Go.
Well, I could fall back on the crucial conversations models, right? And it's content, pattern, relationship. If I'm focused on just the thing that happened, I'm probably wrong. If I'm saying, well, you do this all the time, or you never do this thing, well, I may also be wrong there too. But is the relationship grounded in that trust, respect, and an understanding of people's competence? And it's usually the relationship that is at heart there. And it's not just, do I trust you or not? As the manager, it's, am I showing up in the way you need me, employee?
Yeah.
Absolutely. One thing I want to kind of go back. We talked a little bit about that balancing act around, modeling humility and self-confidence, especially as a female leader or, any leader, honestly, to some extent. My best advice for you, if you're unsure of when it's the right moment to model humility, is if you are the person in a position of power or privilege, the answer is yes. I think that it's a very complicated question, but to give the least complicated answer, I always default to, are you the person in a position of power? Are you the manager or the leader? Are you in a position of privilege in some way in the scenario? If that's the case, you're not going wrong by saying sorry, by taking accountability, by looking for ways to support others. And it makes a huge impact on others when you take that moment to have that humility and accountability.
Oh, Stephanie, I think we can have a whole nother separate topic on power dynamics.
Oh yes, it's my favorite thing to talk about, Lori. Don't get me started. We'll never stop.
It is. It's you're so true and so right in so many different ways. And more that I'm in who I am everywhere. I walk into rooms knowing that I have an enormous amount of privilege in a lot of different areas, right? And whatever I share, and I choose to share, and I speak on a lot of these different topics publicly, it's amazing how many folks will come up to me afterwards and thank me. And so that just shows me there's not enough of us doing that act because of those that have privilege. Yeah. Because there's a lot of folks there that don't have privilege in the room that really need our support. And the more we talk about any of these topics, the better that we all can show up.
Absolutely. I agree. I'm sure you guys have seen the meme. It's like Instagram versus reality. So many of us, when we get in positions of power or leadership, we're still showing Instagram. And I think the more of us that show reality, just the better the world will be, because I think that's humility. I think that's showing, hey, none of us are perfect, and that's okay. We're human. And how do we move past that? And how do we find our best selves and become our best selves with that?
Yeah.
So want to ask, one thing that I think is important for us to hit on, because responsiveness is a big piece of this principle as well, is, when you or your organization make a mistake or inflict harm, whether intentionally or unintentionally, hopefully unintentionally, how do you recommend you approach a meaningful response or resolution to the issue?
I have a strong opinion about this one. I'll go.
Go.
Take it away.
I think it needs to be iterative. First things first, do not add insult to injury by delaying until everything is, perfect. Mm-hmm. Do something as soon as you recognize that there is a problem. It doesn't have to be, the full on, resolution or healing moment, but even just a simple, not the intent, so sorry, and we're going to now work with, if it's appropriate, with you, injured party, employee, consumer, whomever. We're going to work with you in dialogue to determine what the right, reasonable response is. But I think so many, it goes back to that. We're afraid of being wrong. We're afraid of failure, even though we all make mistakes, and companies are made of people. So they reflect that when there's an error, we want to deny it. And instead there needs to be that immediate, we're not taking blame necessarily, but we recognize that this wasn't what we wanted for the outcome. We acknowledge that, and then we're going to keep working through the process and being clear at the start that it's iterative, that it's not a one and done is so vital. Again, the employee that I harmed, it was, we went out to coffee, we met outside of work. It was a months long process because it wasn't going to be done simply. And frankly, I had to work through my own issues surrounding it. And companies and leaders need to do the same thing. So, like you said, strong opinions.
You make a great point, Kate. There was one scenario that I was thinking about, not too distant past. Consultants pinged me immediately and said, I just got reamed out on a call and I think it was unprofessional. And all I needed in that moment was to know that my consultants needed me. And I immediately took action to inform the other party that I'm aware of something happened. It didn't go down well. And just to let you know, I have a zero tolerance policy against X, Y, and Z. We need to talk immediately. In that moment, I didn't need to know the specifics. I didn't need to know who was right or wrong, anything. I just needed the acknowledgement to be known what my position was, regardless of all the other stuff, so that we can then move forward. Because it was clear to me in that moment, there was some boundary that was stepped over, intentionally or not, it didn't matter, but I needed to put that firm boundary to make that very clear. And that was one of the first times I actually really had to do that. And it was nerve-wracking, but I knew in that moment, like I had to take care of my people. And things unfolded and there was more things to learn and there was lots to your iterative process, right? Like, so then there was more creation, all that sort of stuff. But I felt like taking that stance about principal value positions is important in this process, right? So that you're quick to define that.
Yeah. Dory, that's like the third or fourth time that you've talked about values in our time together. And one, I'm really curious to know what yours are because they seem to be central to you. But I also think that we can't leave values outside of this conversation. And that if your values don't reflect humility and responsiveness, your team, your company, your fill in the blank, whatever the endeavor is, you're not going to end up having that.
Yeah. So that's very interesting
environment
question.
That's safe for people.
Yeah. Because I've done a lot of work on my personal values and I've carried them over to my company. And what comes down to me is inspiring. I need to inspire. I need to connect. I need to empower. And I need to hold this concept of dialectical space. And as long as I can hold those four true to me, and I operate from that, then I make my company decisions from that. Would I say that my company has those? No, I use more of like a rethink, reshape, remake as a value proposition for my company, but it's all from wanting to inspire, wanting to connect and empower, and also hold the space for both sides for me.
Everyone wants to work with Dory now, so Dory's amazing. I'm always in awe of her. So yes, absolutely. I'm like, I can't believe it. I can, but I can't. We're almost out of time. And I always like to end on this question because I always get such amazing answers from each of our panelists. But do you have any recommendations for our listeners who want to learn more, whether it's about humility, responsiveness, maybe something else you've talked about today, a book, a podcast, an article, just anything that you would recommend to our listeners if they want to learn more or grow more in this space?
I mean, this isn't a professional resource per se, but everyone needs to read Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, if you haven't, to really go inward and be able to lead with who you really are, the essence of who you are. To me, that's a really great resource. Think Like a Monk 1000%. And obviously the 5-minute rule by Mel Robbins, like all of these, go check it out.
Amazing. Awesome. Thank you. I always have so much, not that I need any more books, but I always end up with like 8 more
Love the
books to
book.
read after these.
Kate, did you want to go?
I grabbed mine. It's
Oh,
a book
good
called
for you.
Soundtracks. Yeah, I also have a book problem. My first full-time job was managing a bookstore. So it is about managing overthinking and kind of retraining your inner critic to not be a critic, but to be a help. Which is, I can't say enough about what I think is the general need for all of us to have some help with that stilling of what I think of as, the negative chorus. But it's funny, it's kind, it's a fast read. It's also very like practical. You can very easily apply what he's talking about. And then, strengths, so that you can understand, because humility isn't saying I'm bad at everything, right? It's embracing what I'm good at and owning up to what I'm not great at. So anything to do with strengths, and anything from Amy Edmondson.
Huge fan. Also, we have to plug your podcast, Kate.
Oh, why, thank you.
Podcast with us.
Yes. And then you can also check out my podcast, The Comfy Chairs. And I'm currently editing the episode where Stephanie is my guest.
Awesome. That's so cool.
Fun too.
Yeah, it is fun. I'm having trouble because I'm like, I want it all to stay in, but I also don't want a 90-minute podcast.
Yeah. Sometimes we like those too. You don't necessarily have to cut them out. Make them into 2, part 1, part 2. You can just edit it that way. I wanted to do a shout out to On-Site Workshops. On-Site Workshops is an organization in Tennessee, and they also have a facility in California, as well as some equine workshops in Colorado, and I think in Montana. But they have a program called Emotionally Smart Leadership, which is really cost effective and gets at all of what we're talking about today, because in order to do any of this work, you got to do your own work first. Yeah. So that program, and I've put at least one of my employees through it, and I'm going to probably put more through it as well, because it really does. It speaks to everything that kind of containerizes and puts it in a perspective that is then applicable everywhere, which is, I also think pretty cool. And everyone can benefit from their own other relationships, not just work relationships, but other relationships as well. So, that's On-Site Workshops.
Amazing. Great. Amazing recommendations as always. I cannot thank each of you enough. What an amazing conversation. Dory, Julia, Kate, again, thank you so much for your candor and your willingness to talk about probably one of the toughest principles of trauma-informed workplaces, but also one of the most meaningful. Thank you all so much, and thank you all for listening in. Don't miss out on our next panel discussion, which will be on cultural, gender, and historical issues.
Oh boy, that's a good one.
Nice.
That's a big one.